This is not the first event to actually target Muslims, both in Canada itself, but also in Europe. And more importantly, one of the largest attacks is the Christchurch in New Zealand. So with us today is really three dear colleagues that are part of our overall work on Islamophobia at a global level. Professor Jasmin Zine from Wilfrid Laurier University. She has been doing tremendous work on Islamophobia, mapping Islamophobia, documenting Islamophobia in the Canadian context, but also in comparisons. She's a frequent visitor for us at the Center for Islamophobia Studies, and also a co-organizer for the International Islamophobia Research Studies and Research Association. So Professor Jasmin, welcome, and it's good to have you with us. And if I could get you to actually turn your camera on, it's welcome, it's great to have you. Professor Yasmin Jiwani is also a professor that works in intersectionality, on issues of race, on media. And recently, she really contributed tremendously to the co-edited volume in the Islamophobia Studies Journal. It is something that is accessible in JSTOR, so please, please, please make sure to access the publication. And really, her work has been tremendous, looking at both the context of Canada, but also in a comparative way, especially in the digital arena and the media and the impact that we have. So Professor Yasmin, it's a pleasure to have you from Concordia University, one of my favorites in Montreal, right there downtown, very beautiful area to walk in. And our third guest is Professor Adnan Husain, whom also a colleague that I know from his times at UC Berkeley. We both studied within the same 2-3 buildings, so we don't get confused around Berkeley. From Queen's University in Canada, he also does work on Islamophobia and contributed a number of pieces. One of the pieces that I still think it's very critical is the proto-Islamophobia that presented at UC Berkeley. So welcome, Adnan, and it's good to have you with us today. So really what I wanted, maybe as we begin the conversation for our audience, to put your questions in the Q&A bucket, and we'll definitely access those. And also you could share the live stream on Facebook and other places for us to have a larger conversation on the subject. So maybe we could begin the conversation of what happened, what was the event, because in the press in here, it says that it was a truck that struck people. So again, from knowing that trucks don't drive themselves, at least until now, so how do we understand what happened, and just maybe take us through some of the immediate reporting and the context of this attack. And anyone could jump, maybe Professor Yasmin, you want to start? Yasmin, you want to start on that? And then we take it to the group.
Sure. So the story goes that it was a family going for an evening stroll outside, and a truck came and basically ran into them. And the truck itself was outfitted like as if it was a police cruiser. And the person inside was wearing a bulletproof vest and a helmet. And the interesting part of this is that it was a brazen attack. It wasn't exactly something that was like, you know, a surreptitious or what we've come across and what we commonly encounter, which are the microaggressions. This was an outright attack of violence, premeditated and clearly something that was targeted. So, and it was interesting in a way because it, again, you know, much like what happened after 9/11, when it was some of the Sikhs that were working at the gas station that were attacked because they looked like Muslims. So here you have a family whose clothing signifies an otherness in the Canadian context, and that's clearly the target. So the framing so far has been, from what I understand, very much a matter of, again, a kind of tension between some political authorities framing it as a case of terrorism and others that are looking at it as something that was not terrorism, but simply a lone wolf kind of expedition of violence conducted by somebody who is mentally challenged. So the same tropes that are used even in terms of domestic violence are being used here. If it's a Muslim man that is, perpetrating domestic violence, then it becomes an honor crime. If it's a white man, then it's clearly somebody who has mental challenges.
And
So that's the
Jasmin?
story.
Yes, I think, what was significant about this case was that from the outset, the police were quick to identify that this was an act of Islamophobic violence, that it was a hate crime, and that it was a deliberate attempt, in a sense, to these family was marked for death. They were targeted specifically for this extermination. There's a lot we don't know about the individual responsible. A lot of the social media was already scrubbed, or there's nothing available to find. We're hearing, the stories from the neighbor that this was a loner. He was at night gaming, and they had to sort of intervene when he'd be making a lot of noise, this sort of thing. And these seem to also be, along the lines of the tropes that Yasmin is talking about when we hear these, stories about, well, this is out of character. This is not someone who we would, he's just the guy next door. Co-workers are surprised. He worked in an egg factory in a nearby town in London. And so we're not hearing the red flags, which doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? We're not hearing any concrete links as yet to white nationalist groups in Canada. And I want to say that there are about 300 white nationalist groups in this country. My research project on the Islamophobia industry, we've been monitoring about 13 that are very expressly Islamophobic. But you don't need to be a card-carrying member of any of these groups to be in league with them, to be ideologically in league with them. People are able to be on the internet and find community among these various kinds of groups and to share these ideologies, which sometimes then, lead to these horrific acts of violence. So we don't know, a lot hasn't emerged as yet. And so we're watching to see when we can find out more about any insight as to this assailant and what specific motivations were. But I think the fact that the police were very quick to talk about it as hate crime, to talk about it as Islamophobia, means that they do have evidence that they're probably not sharing at this point.
Adnan, would you add anything to at least the event and how it is described and approached?
Well, I think that the main point is that it was described initially as a kind of hate crime. I think the real issue or question that I would have is the way in which, while that might be atypical, the narratives surrounding it also do try and make it seem as if it is a very exceptional, act by a lone person who can be easily separated out from Canadian society and Canadian culture. And that's really the danger. Of course, we know that there are all these hate groups. There's so many of them that you can, even if they're fringe, that they obviously have a palpable presence in some sectors of social media where they nurture a culture of fear and paranoia and hatred. And while those can be kind of marginalized, I think increasingly we have to say that and acknowledge that while this is a terrible violent act that has seized all of our attention, rightly so, that nonetheless on a daily level Muslims face Islamophobia widely. It's endemic. It's not some marginal phenomenon. It may not rise to the levels of extreme violence all the time, but we'll probably get into this, and the others on the panel can probably speak more precisely about it. But, hostile attitudes towards Muslims are quite widespread in Canadian society. And we have to think about this as just the tip of the iceberg of daily harassment, of decisions that never achieve media attention, of decisions in the workplace for jobs, promotion, housing discrimination, harassment on the streets for visible Muslims. And I think that is, to me, what is the most disturbing aspect of this, is that in the Quebec City Mosque massacre that took place in 2017, Muslims in a house of worship were targeted. And that's obviously a visible symbol of Muslim community presence. In this case, and that is horrible, but what's even more disturbing to me is how, in a casual way, on a walk, as Dr. Jiwani was mentioning, they were targeted. These people were targeted and killed on the public streets in a Canadian town, casually on a walk during this pandemic. We're actually still under lockdown, so almost the only thing you can do is to get out and take a walk in a park or on the street. And they were victims of looking Muslim, of being visibly Muslim, not in an identifiably Muslim space where you would find them, just out in society. And that, to me, is something that is why it's receiving the kind of attention this time, is because it's even more disturbing that it happened that way.
Maybe that gets us into the larger question, which from the United States, often people look at Canada and they think that it's really much better, so much so that when Trump was elected, people thought, well, we're going to go up to Canada. Even post 9/11, people sought refuge in Canada. So there is this narrative about Canada in relations to inclusivity, in relations to how it deals with Muslims and minorities, that is really is much, much better than the United States. So how accurate is that narrative? And where are the points that we can actually challenge?
It's not accurate. I mean, there is, I have to say something as a scholar that is situated in Canada and that has worked primarily on Canadian case studies. Canadian racism is different. Mm-hmm. It's different insofar as it tends not to be in your face. It tends to be more polite. It tends to be more insidious. They're not going to tell you that they're not going to rent you the apartment. They're just going to say to you, well, I'm sorry, but it's gone. You just came too late. Mm. Or they'll make up some other kind of excuse. So I think it's even harder. I would suspect, and I do recall growing up in that kind of environment, where it's actually harder to grapple with because it makes you think that you're the one that's insane rather than the system being insane or the society being insane. Mm. So these kinds of acts I call spectacular forms of violence. And what Adnan has referred to are the vernacular forms of violence that are operating every day, that have a corrosive effect on you and that eat away at your very soul. So those are very much there and very dangerous. I think it's when we have something up front, we can organize. We can, a lot of the stuff that I've been looking at in terms of what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Quebec mosque shooting was the fact that the communities really came together, especially on social media platforms like Twitter, and coalesced and demanded, some kind of state recognition. They made sure that the story never died down. Mm. And that's one of the things about Canadian racism, is that it operates with a very strong sort of toxic veneer of erasure. Mm. You will forget. And time immemorial, this is exactly what's happened, especially in terms of the indigenous, to indigenous peoples. So these spectacular forms sort of open up a moment and people come together and mobilize. And I think that's the critical point. But otherwise, the kind of racism the Islamophobia that we face here, is corrosive. It'll eat away at your soul because you will never know why you don't get the job, why you don't get to stay where you want to stay, or why people are treating you differently. It's a discourse of denial.
Do we have any data that, at least from studies, some polling, how does it look like from a data perspective, if we have any?
Well, we have. I mean, my team has distilled the polls in Canada, public opinion polls about the Muslim presence over the last almost 20 years, so since the aftermath of 9/11. And what that story tells us about public opinion in Canada is very revealing, and it points to the fact that Islamophobia is not just a product of the far right fringe, that it is widespread public sentiment. So I'll give you some examples for some of the polls and what they've told us. And this may be surprising for people, south of the border and even within Canada, where we default on this idea of a kind of Canadian exceptionalism, that we are not the United States, and that because of multiculturalism, we hold ourselves to a higher standard. But multiculturalism has been a smokescreen behind which there is deeply entrenched inequalities. So if we want to look at the public sentiments about Muslims over the last 2 decades, some of the results show that 46% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of Islam, and more so about Islam than any other religious tradition. Let's see, 52% of Canadians feel that Muslims can only be trusted a little or not at all. 47% of Canadians think that discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault. Right. So a lot of the blaming the victim, or they bring this on themselves. We had 51% supporting government surveillance of mosques, for example. And I can go on and on with the kinds. There was even about a 24% support for a Muslim ban in Canada, similar to what was implemented by Trump south of the border. And so I think that those figures will be surprising to a lot of people, both north and south of the border. But what we've been able to glean from the public opinion over the last 2 decades is that there is a lot of mistrust of Muslims, a lot of sort of fear, and a lot of default onto stereotypes that Muslims are oppressed women, that they are anti-democratic, illiberal minorities who are not assimilating into Canadian society. And, those kinds of ideas are not just from the far right. The far right have their own conspiracy theories, about Muslims as the Trojan horse that is coming to, through creeping Sharia, will take over Western civilization, will provide a demographic takeover or civilizational takeover, and so on. We're familiar with those kinds of conspiracy theories, but on the other hand, you have widespread, and these are primarily national polls that have indicated that there is this level of anti-Muslim racism that is pervasive. And so when we talk about both the Quebec massacre and now this horrific attack in London, we can see that the ingredients were already there to create a breeding ground for these kinds of actions. And the problem is that we knew that 4 years ago already when the Quebec massacre happened. And unfortunately, there was a failure to act upon, for example, motion 103 was tabled by Liberal MP Iqra Khalid, Muslim MP, to look at Islamophobia in Canada, to document it along with systemic racism and religious discrimination. And there were, a public inquiry, there were parliamentary hearings, a report emerged from that after hearing from about 600 people, excuse me, and that report basically sidelined Islamophobia. Out of 30 recommendations in that report, only 2 of them pertain to Islamophobia. So here we are, 4 years later, and we still have not had concrete action on Islamophobia. We have policies in our government that are normalizing Islamophobia through security policies that target Muslims for racial profiling. Muslims have been the primary focus of our security agencies, not the far right white nationalists. So while they have been asleep at the wheel in looking at those groups, those are the groups that are emerging, that are becoming more violent and ideologically driven. And policies, for example, in Quebec, like Bill 21, which are regulating and policing Muslim women's attire. So, sacrificing religious freedom on the altar of secularism and trying to cover that in the guise of, protecting, secular society and so on, but really fomenting a form of institutionalized gendered Islamophobia. So all these ingredients are there in the Canadian landscape for these kinds of actions to coalesce and to emerge. And those still haven't changed. And so we need to do things differently now. And we need to hold the politicians and institutions of society accountable. We saw many of them at a vigil yesterday, talking about the need to challenge Islamophobia. And some of those same politicians voted against Motion 103. Some of those same politicians are supporting Israel. And you cannot have those take that position on Islamophobia and at the same time be engaged in politics, which is actually fomenting Islamophobia. So it's a time for truth telling and a time for accountability.
Adnan, you started us with this conversation.
Yeah, yes. Well, I mean, so many excellent points made by my fellow panelists. What a wonderful conversation to have. Just on that question of Canada's exceptionalism, I mean, I think one thing that was raised was mentioning the Indigenous, community and how much they have suffered from extreme racism from the state, and I think, what is really quite amazing to me is how we have this constellation of one Sunday, we have the report about the release, the discovery of 215 Indigenous children's remains being found in Kamloops, BC, at the site of a former Catholic residential school. That just raises what has actually been accomplished since 2015 with the Truth and Reconciliation, Commission report that was supposed to introduce some real truth about Canada's history. Clearly, there's so much more that is undiscovered and has been ignored. It's been an exercise really in saying, okay, now we're finished because we've had this report. One Sunday, and then the next Sunday, this hateful, Islamophobic, violent attack on visible Muslims walking down a public street. And I think within these two poles, you see really Canada's mask. We're still wearing them because of COVID, but this mask has slipped, with these two events that show that its foundation as a settler colonial state, was one of violence, of racial violence, of exclusion. And, that today it's that same project is being bolstered by, creating Muslims as this unique, unassimilable threat to liberal order and multicultural society that has to be evicted from, public order. And I think it's really important for Muslims, at this time who are becoming politically active to engage in the struggle against Islamophobia, in making demands of their politicians to recognize the real target that we have to have here, which is not just trying to ask for accommodation within the system, but to recognize that there's a deeper and endemic problem that puts many groups into situations of vulnerability, of marginalization in facing racism. And we have to have solidarity with those struggles and not come to Canadian society. Yes, it may be a haven from war and economic deprivation because of the overall structures of capitalism that have made the global South suffer, all this harm. But don't think that Canada, that the end is the end of the struggle and is the heaven on earth, because it is also predicated on violence, and we see that how it's functioning. It just reminds me of that there's such a long history and intertwined history of these structures of oppression, because these residential schools, they remind me of what the Catholic authorities in medieval Spain, after the forcible conversion of Muslims after the conquest of Granada, when they were forcibly converted Muslims, they became Moriscos, known as Moriscos. They were, Christianized, but, they held on to aspects of their faith, culture, language. Their children were also targeted with laws to remove them from their families, to suppress their language, to enforce the, change of their religious identity in schools established in the Catholic Church. And when the Moriscos were expelled from Spain, children under 10 were kept because they were held to be assimilable, right? This is the problem, is that the Muslim has been seen as unassimilable in Western society. Even if you forcibly convert them, they're still unassimilable. So this is a lesson that I think we really have to take on board, that you cannot just hope to assimilate into Canadian society. We need to transform it into an equitable, one that isn't predicated upon racial suppression and difference. I think
you bring in an important piece in here. In responding to Islamophobia, as you know, there's been many different attempts or theories. One of those that, in essence, asks the Muslim to be better at assimilation and integration of the society. And maybe we could begin to ask the question, in responding to Islamophobia, is the assimilation track integration? And you can add to it the Islam 101 presentation, that if they just know how good we are, all of a sudden, they'll appreciate not only the food, but us. How much of that, at least that we continue to contend with as a theoretical approach to countering Islamophobia?
Well, before you go there, I wanted to just bring something up because it really relates to both what Jasmin has said and also what Adnan pointed out, which is the whole thing about language. So the interesting thing about the news coverage that I noticed today was, in fact, that this is no longer called Islamophobia. It's not called right-wing extremism. It's now called ideologically motivated violent extremism, IMVE. And labels, as Stuart Hall says, carry a lot of semiotic weight. So the way in which the Canadian government has manipulated or massaged itself out of this quandary is to basically blanket this term as something else. And when it becomes something else, and when you don't call it what it is, then how difficult is it to sort of come up with a solution or with some kind of ways or some powerful interventions? So that's one thing. But the other thing that I also wanted to point out in relation to what Adnan says, that I think is really important and that often gets forgotten in this, because you mentioned, Adnan, that this is a Canadian settler state. It's a white settler state, is the fact that colonization always rested on a hierarchy of power with people at the bottom and people at the top and people sandwiched in between. The COVID-19 pandemic has been really interesting because it's cast light, the media gaze, on different bodies at different points in time of the pandemic, beginning with sort of a powerful rush from in terms of an oppositional tactic with the Black Lives Matter, moving to the anti-Asian racism, moving to something else. So it's like, it's a kaleidoscopic gaze that has sort of like turned around. But what it also does is it obfuscates the fact that there's a hierarchy always present. So that hierarchy really leads me to always go back to Michel Foucault's work, because although he was influenced by the Black Panthers, he never admitted to being influenced by them. But he does make a distinction between two very sort of like interesting polar ends in terms of this sort of process of colonization. One is the sort of the savage who is always out there, the barbarian. And the distinction is that the barbarian has his own or her own civilization. And their primary goal is to destroy Western civilization and install their own. And then, of course, there is the savage, the noble savage, as in the savage that can be cultivated, assimilated, and civilized along the process. And that's exactly how the colonial settler state has worked, because it will, take in those, and you can see that with the history of Indigenous people in terms of who has actually been allowed, when can they become full citizens, when they participate in war, when they do a number of different things. So that citizenship is always conditional. But with the barbarians, there's always this sort of like, you get the, how do you get the barbaric out of the barbarian? That's how they're thinking. So when we think about, I don't know if Jasmin Zine has mentioned this, but we had a barbaric hotline. What was it called? Something like that.
It was
Zero
the
tolerance.
Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, and then there was a hotline where you could well, it was a proposal that wasn't followed through on, but it was a proposal that you could snitch on your neighbors if you thought that they were becoming barbarians in some form, right?
I
But
think it
it's
was
still there in the citizenship
Yeah.
documents. So whenever you go for citizenship, you're supposed to learn all about the country. And one of the big things is, in fact, that you don't engage in these barbaric cultural practices. That's what it's called. So the barbarian is always located outside as that threat. And that's why I keep coming back to the whole colonial structure, because it's predicated on that. You bring these barbarians in, what I call barbarians, if you can empty out their cultures, assimilate them, but also use and abuse them and then discard them.
Now, did they include the invasion of foreign countries as barbaric acts, or that was just seen as a part of tourism and vacation?
That's very civilized. Well, notably, they end up changing the name. It was called the S7, Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices. And the name was just too over the top. It was meant, to signal. It was meant to signal that the conservative Tory government was going to target vulnerable immigrants and protect white, implicitly Christian Canadian identity from these terrible immigrants who are coming and bringing their misogyny and their, other forms of cruelty. So this was, the kind of rationale behind it, and it was mostly, in order to satisfy the interest of certain segments of the electorate. When there was pushback, they ended up changing the name of it. But it was very interesting that at that same vigil in London, Ontario yesterday, where all of the party political leaders showed up, that Jagmeet Singh, the new Democrat Party leader who wears a turban and a big beard as a Sikh, a practicing Sikh person, he called out the country as a racist country. He said that it was an Islamophobic country, that Muslims weren't safe in this country. And he said that in order to change things from now on, no politician should ever again use or exploit Islamophobia for political and electoral gain, which is very brave of him to do so. And I think it does call out exactly why this act and many other acts were used really for political purposes, a lot like the Sharia referenda in the United States, that were put on ballots basically to turn out the vote, not because anybody really recognizes any real, genuine legal threat of Sharia. So it was this electoral exploitation of Islamophobia. So it was very brave of him and perceptive to call it out. I think, however, what it begs the question is how could it ever not be used politically if it can be used politically? If you have a society that is willing, to listen to these dog whistles, and not even sometimes dog whistles, but explicit call exploitation of Islamophobia, it sort of begs the question also of the fact that whenever we're talking about Islamophobia, particularly in a place like Canada, as Yasmin was pointing out, is that they have a different way of articulating and expressing it. Often it's not so explicit, it's more implicit. And as a result, there are always other rationales, for the pursuit of these policies. So Bill 21 is this laïcité. It's the culmination of the 1960s Quiet Revolution, which was freeing us from the terrible domination, supposedly, of the Catholic Church. And this is just continuing that process. So it's actually part of a radical liberationist kind of movement. They won't cop to the fact that really it's about the marginalization and exclusion of Muslims principally, but also other religious minorities that can't be assimilated easily into their sense of the normative identity, which is in Quebec of white, Christian background, Francophone men. So this is, I think, really what's behind this legislation that has really prepared the ground and reinforced Islamophobia, not just as a social problem, but, in government and, by politicians.
I'll come back to my questions about integration, simulation, and theories of dealing with Islamophobia. Maybe as you pick up on the question of, what is the normative construction within the Canadian society, a question arises in general about the limitations that are imposed on Muslims, limitations that are imposed in academia, the subjects that you could speak of and the subject that you don't speak of, and who is seem to be canceled versus the ones that their cancellation is not actually admissible. So maybe we could have a conversation to expand the conversation on these battles right now, that both in academia and outside of academia, where Muslim subject is there but is not there simultaneously. Jasmin?
Well, I think, sure. The question of academic freedom is, one that is often used as a shield against, to protect against accusations of racism and so on. That many are trying to purvey these ideas, Islamophobic ideas. We know in Canada who those particular kinds of academics are, and we'll cover that in academic freedom as a guise and as a shield for their views. And at the same time, it's difficult for Muslim scholars or those who are wanting to talk about these issues, themselves become challenged, whether it's from, talking about Islamophobia and, having that challenged, or whether it's from outside political interests that are increasingly influencing, what can and cannot be said within universities, who can and cannot be hired, what political views you are taking, and that has been at the forefront of a lot of concerns in Canada within the academy. In terms of that kind of academic freedom, we've had, in Ontario, we had the IIHRA come in provincially. We've been very concerned about that, not only in Ontario, but across Canada, in terms of what that means for academic freedom, in terms of the right to criticize Israel, particularly as a racist endeavor. And so not being able to name the oppression and what's happening, we're concerned with, well, okay, if IIHRA is in effect, and the criticism of Israel as a racist endeavor is therefore illegal because this has come in as under legislation, then, well, can I teach Edward Said? Can I teach, other scholars, Akili Membe or Hatem Bazian, anyone who has critiqued the state of Israel? Can I say that? Will I have to erase, half of my syllabus as a result? So there are ways in which these, policies are encroaching on academic freedom and what can and cannot be said, and how outside lobby groups, particularly, powerful pro-Zionist lobby groups, are influencing the what can and cannot be said in universities. And so this is something that we need to actually be quite concerned about as scholars, and the impact it has on academic freedom. And so this is something that, we have been trying to address, and about 30 universities and unions across Canada have actually passed motions against the IIHRA in order to protect academic freedom and to situate that within an anti-colonial framework and an anti-racist framework. Because if we cannot call out racism, we can call out racism in Canada, but we cannot call out racism when it comes to the state of Israel. That makes no sense. And it detracts from the work that Canada is trying to do around the question of decolonization. All of the universities are bringing in this language around equity, diversity, inclusion, around decolonizing. And yet at the same time, we are having these pressures around the IIHRA, which actually detract from that. So those are some of the political concerns and issues that we also have to grapple with in academia.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that, because it was actually quite shocking to me being at a union meeting, actually, which was debating this motion,
Mm.
which had actually been introduced as a motion after much struggle, and how, in fact, it was dealt with, but also hearing people who talked about the chill. So it's sort of like, even though, I mean, the IHR is there, and even though we might have a motion against it, there is a chilling effect. You cannot talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as such. If you were, you are open to, because for one thing, I think racialized faculty are under surveillance all the time. So we're hyper surveilled. And then on top of that is everything is watched, because at any moment, if you open the yourself to vulnerability, you could suffer the consequences. So it's a pretty, it's a dangerous road to walk, because you're not certain where the attack is going to come from or under what guise it's going to come in. It's not always in your face. It's a lot easier when it's in your face.
Well, maybe Neil is also maybe the comment that trying to deal with Islamophobia or counter Islamophobia, you do need the resources. And therefore, since much of the Islamophobic industry is connected to the hip to many of the pro-Israel organizations and groups, at least in the United States, Pamela Geller, Daniel Pipes, Stephen Emerson, Frank Gaffney, all these groups, how to navigate, on the one hand, being able to do the work, on the other, the need of resources institutionally and support. How does it look like in Canada?
I think it looks just as bad, because I'm thinking about what happened at U of T, for instance. There was a person who was hired and then unhired, because the board of directors felt like her research was going into that area. I don't know how whether Adnan or Jasmin, you know about this case.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's happened is that there's a censuring of the university right now. But is that going to change the board of governors or the board of directors? I very much doubt it. So it's like, the power is there, it's concentrated, it's consolidated over time. And the question is, how do you get by? And I think the only way to get by these structures of power is either in parallel institutions or circumventing around them, in a tactical way. And that has always been, like, when I look at, say, for instance, the stuff on Twitter, then I'm really like, actually, I'm amazed at how critical the perspective is, and how Muslims are coming together, how they're talking, and they won't forget. You see, this is the most important thing. They don't allow us to forget all of those incidences from I'm not even thinking back to the 2017 mosque shooting. I'm thinking back to even before. So Jasmine, your work in terms of the Eruville code of life, and even before that. So everything is layered, and you can see that, and it keeps that history alive. And so it holds, it makes us more, in a sense, aware that this isn't a one-off thing. There's a long chain here. And that's what helps us hold the state accountable. And for me, those are the only sort of a pedagogy of hope, actually, because I can't see any other way out.
Adnan, you wanted to say something about Timothy Brennan and his presentation?
Oh no, I just think that this is a huge issue for scholars working on any aspect of Middle East, Islamic world, Muslim diasporic experience in Europe and North America, is that there is a campaign to suppress academic freedom when it comes to topics that challenge some of these pieties, and particularly, of course, as everyone has alluded, that the real third rail is Palestine. And there's just a lot of intimidation. And I think even among people you would hope and expect to be allies, liberals, even people who are leftist and normally committed to all kinds of anti-racism work and so on, is that they become very nervous about the charge of anti-Semitism. And I think the expansion of the cases and examples in this IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, definition of anti-Semitism is very vicious and pernicious in, enrolling all of the criticisms of Israel essentially into, the charge of anti-Semitism, and the fact that this has been adopted in Ontario as part of the human rights code and legislation is deeply, deeply concerning. We held a forum and a panel to talk about exactly this question, and how is it going to be possible to teach Middle Eastern history in a history department on a university campus, as we do in my department. If you can't talk about what happened in 1948 with the Nakba, where the Palestinian refugee crisis emerged, what happened in 1967, and whether this is part of a violation of international law or not. Just basic kinds of questions are now under threat of being characterized and as anti-Semitism. And so there are people who we've hired to teach courses who have been in a panic situation, saying, well, do I have to talk about Israel-Palestine? They want to cut these things out of their courses because they're untenured, they're casual, so this is really a problem for the most vulnerable in the academy in particular, is people who don't have established positions and tenure and so on. Can they actually teach the truth, history about these sorts of topics without risking their career? And the real cancel culture, I know that in the US and even in Canada, there's all this hyperventilating about the cancel culture. The real cancel culture is, pro-Palestine, speech on campus and in the political sphere. And that has come in a really dramatic way to Canada with the IHRA definition being adopted. And actually, Jasmin should really speak about the campaign against it, because she is instrumental in organizing faculty unions against it. But, this is not easy to do. People who are very intelligent, reasonable, and committed to human, values and anti-racism, they are panicked by this. They've managed to put so much pressure that it's very difficult to get people to be brave on this issue. Although I do think that the recent invasion, the Israeli aggression is the force that is actually making the case and the argument and in changing the political calculus, because it's very difficult for people to see the bombardment of Gaza and the eviction of people from Sheikh Jarrah, and these aggressive postures to express dominance over Muslim holy places in the vicinity of Al-Aqsa. These things are being broadcast, and they make the argument against them. But still, of course, there is such an active and strong campaign that it's not easy for people to act on their principles.
Yesterday, I described it in terms of some of our liberal colleagues, that they are the people that will join you to hug a tree, but if a Palestinian is on the tree, they will actually chop it. So that's what you have in relations to the position. So literally, they would be with you to protect it, but if it's a Palestinian on the tree, they will be, immediately moving to chop the tree in general. I wanted to get into a question, and Jasmin, if you want to, expand on this, feel free to do so. But a question on really the position of the Muslim woman, especially also Muslim woman with the hijab, both in terms of the data here, the data in US, in France, that 80 to 85% of violent Islamophobic incidents target Muslim women and Muslim women in hijab. But it seems that the Muslim woman is not seen as a woman at that point. So you don't see the solidarity of women organizations or feminist organizations. So how do we really think and deal with this phenomena that is so evident in front of us?
Yeah, thank you for, bringing gender into the conversation around Islamophobia, because gendered Islamophobia is often the most visible, way in which Islamophobia gets enacted because of Muslim women who are visibly marked that way. And, I think in Canada, we have a history in Quebec of, decades of various iterations of policies to, ban Muslim women's attire and to keep it out of the public sphere. Bill 21 being the current one, but there's been many iterations of that, and a kind of what I call a sort of a sartorial nationalism that becomes enacted through trying to perform your national identity through what you are wearing, whether or not you are accepted in the nation or whether you are exiled from it on the basis of that attire. So the hijab has always, and the niqab have operated as these signifiers of difference and abject difference and backwardness and, Muslim male misogyny and, the lack of agency for Muslim women. And so that has obviously culminated in this coerced unveiling of Muslim women in not just Canada or Quebec, but in other contexts. But, as I was thinking about, as Yasmin was talking about all the layers of Islamophobia that we need to unpack, and, I've been doing this work for a very long time and I've been talking all day on media, but I always forget things. And I'm realizing how many things I have forgotten, even in my conversations, today. And, for example, Yasmin mentioned Hérouville and this, small town in Quebec that created this manifesto basically to keep out who they felt were going to be, culturally pollute their society and their community, even though there were no visible minorities around them. But there was this sort of figure of the Muslim woman that gets produced in this narrative, even though it's never explicitly named. But Muslim women's bodies have played this role of various kinds of danger, civilizational danger, reproductive danger. There's a biopolitics attached to Muslim women. And so when we talk about, even some of the contemporary conspiracy theories like demographic replacement, it is the figure of the Muslim woman that comes in as this, you've seen these images and these posters of a pregnant Muslim woman, in a burqa, and her stomach is a bomb. There's a fuse where her belly button is, right? And that's one of the most downloaded images. And, that's, it signifies that pervasive threat that Muslim women's bodies represent a kind of reproductive power in that they will be a demographic threat because Muslims will simply, proliferate and take over. They represent the cultural and civilizational danger because of how they dress and what that signifies, right? In the in the Orientalist imaginary of how Muslim women have been constituted historically and still operate as that signifier of fear and difference. And then I was reminded of, the Sharia tribunal issue in Canada back in 2003, 2004, where there was an amendment to the Arbitration Act, not even an amendment, it was, the Arbitration Act in Ontario allowed for faith-based arbitration. And you had, for example, Jewish Beit Dins that were operating where people could adjudicate civil matters outside of a secular court and use religious principles to come to terms when it came to issues of, marriage, divorce, custody, or business matters, right? It's civil affairs. But when Muslims were like, oh, okay, well, how about us? Maybe we should have a tribunal that is faith-based where we can arbitrate our issues relating to the same kinds of things, civil matters of, divorce, marriage, custody, all of these things. Why not use our, Sharia law if you choose to do that as an opportunity? And that was met with huge Islamophobic pushback and imagery that people were going to be stoned behind the parliament buildings, or, there would be beheadings or people having their hands cut, all of the worst, Islamophobic vitriol and racist fears and fantasies were unleashed through that proposal. And of course, it was also about the vulnerable Muslim woman who was going to be subject to, this male patriarchy. And so in that as well, there were feminists that were very quick to fall into that, bandwagon of, well, Islam is inherently misogynistic. These women will, need the vanguardism of white feminism in order to become enlightened and to liberate them from this backward misogynistic faith. And all of that started to, erupt. And that was here in Ontario. That also is part of that layering and the groundwork. And so even in my, mind and memory of the work I've been doing over the years, I forget things because there's too many. There's simply too many examples that we begin to forget, even so. I think the issue of gender and gendered Islamophobia is really, really important. And it has led to the targeting of Muslim women. We've had a lot of Black Muslim women who were recently subject to attacks in Western Canada. Visible Muslim women, talk about being fearful when they go on the subway, that they stand against the walls because they don't want to get too close to the tracks in case somebody might push them. Yesterday at the vigil, we heard about Muslim children who are afraid, who are saying, do I look too Muslim to go out? So this tragedy in London, if we bring it back to this, has created such a palpable fear within the community who do not feel safe. And Muslim women are already subject to undue kind of scrutiny and attention, and have extra layers that they need to address in terms of their own physical safety at any given time. All women have to consider that. But the hijab or the niqab poses, further consideration around that. I read something where, another incident we haven't mentioned, also here in Toronto, last year, the caretaker of a mosque was stabbed and killed by someone who professed neo-Nazi sympathies. And his daughter, wrote that after that killing, she stopped wearing her hijab. And she was afraid to go out. And she wrote a message, to support the families, in London. And so we need to see how this is affecting in a longer term Muslim women, but also Muslim youth, right, who are growing up and being socialized in this environment. And, that has been a concern of, a forthcoming book I have on the 9/11 generation. But, these kinds of issues will have repercussions, and already the community, and especially Muslim women, are feeling that sense of precarity and danger.
Yasmin, do you want to add? Because the special journal issue dealt with the gender dimension. I think it'll be very important for you to add some more into this important subject.
Well, all of those tropes that I've drawn heavily on Jasmin's work in this way, and in many other pieces that I've written, because even in looking at online commentary, which is your most sort of like in your face, unguarded, unchecked, kind of commentary that comes at you. These are exactly the same kind of tropes. These women are coming in, they're sort of like creators, or they're perpetuators of terrorism through their children. And so you get this sort of like invasive, the whole idea of being under siege. So that's very much a part of this sort of like the way in which, but this is very common in the way also that, colonial powers have looked at the colonized as being ultra fecund, ultra, fertile, and as being able to breed populations that are going to take over. So how then do we get them sanitized and so forth in order to be able to contain them? And this is exactly what's playing out. But I do want to bring attention to one thing, which is the whole notion of why we forget. And I think there are so many things going on, because I do recall one year when I was teaching discourses on media discourses of the Muslim body, and it was one thing after the other. There were stories about mosques being denied licenses to operate out of particular places, being denied certificates, zoning certificates to construct mosques. There was a case of of the Muslim Students Association and Concordia having sort of like the media come in and basically charge them for all kinds of sort of carrying misogynist literature. And basically the university stepped in, sent their librarians to remove books from that center. This is unheard of. If one were to just put in another body or another group, I don't think we would have seen this kind of sort of, these kinds of violations. So it's, you see that thing happening over and over, and the layered effect of that, it is incredibly corrosive. So I think it's partly that, but the other part of the forgetting is that until we go back and revisit these studies, say for instance, I was looking at Aziza Kanji's incredible study on the news media, showing you, well, every time it's a Muslim perpetrator, it's 1.5 times more attention and story and length of stories and so forth than when it's a white perpetrator. Tells you that the only time we come into the public gaze is when there are problems. So if there are problems and they're identified as problems to the rest of the country all the time, cumulatively, then, what Jasmin was pointing out in terms of these polls makes perfect sense.
Well,
so I think we need to attack it at that level.
Yeah, maybe that's a good way for us to get back to the question about assimilation integration, which touches on all pieces. And I think, what's his name? I'm trying to say, Hassan Salim, he says, can you address even if briefly the issue of integration? Muslims and other minorities are always asked, even by fellow Muslims sometimes, to integrate in order for Islamophobia to end. What does integration even mean? And I think, again, this touches on the issue, just if you were just good and you just double your effort and you present yourself, not only that you're going to make it, but also Islamophobia will end, right? Which is, again, I call it, the beautifying of the Muslim face as a way to end Islamophobia.
I think one of the things that we always have to be mindful of is positionality. Because if you are a refugee that's coming to the country from a war-torn area, then you're going to see assimilation as a safety, a mechanism by which to survive. I don't think you could be condemned for that, because that is where you're coming from. I'm thinking even in, say, for instance, minority Muslim communities in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan who have to sort of take on the appearance of the dominant society in order to be able to survive. So wherever you're going to be attacked, that becomes one strategy. On the other hand, I am also of the opinion that no matter how much you think you're going to assimilate, you're never going to be safe. Because the reality is that even when we look at, say, for instance, I mean, the report that came out of Toronto a while ago on Canada and the creeping apartheid, it really goes to show no matter how good your credentials, no matter what, you will still be at the bottom. And this is how the system keeps itself going, because somebody has to be on the bottom in order for somebody to be on top of them who feels that they're going to make it, and somebody who's going to be on top of that. This is how this system has survived. And this is the colonial blueprint.
Adnan, you wanna?
Well, yeah, I guess I would basically agree with that because, well, firstly, what does integration mean? I mean, that is a good question. And I think you'll see that the goalposts, as it were, the standards and criteria for judging whether you've met what it means to be a good Canadian citizen or a good American citizen, will move. That's one question, and it's a good question. But, my view from the long history, I'm a medieval historian, so, I look at things in centuries of development, and it just seems to me that the Morisco case is very useful in this regard, is that basically we have an analogy that in the past, the demand was, for Muslims to convert, change your religion. Now that we have a secular state, supposedly, even though we have a secularization of Christian culture, that's why Christmas is a holiday, Sunday is the weekend, is that, that it won't be put in the terms of outright conversion, but it is that practice of Islam, being visibly Muslim, is always going to be characterized as unassimilable and as resistance to integration. And so that's, just Muslims practicing their faith is possible to constitute with all this panoply of radicalization theory discourses and programs, that basically use a Muslim woman wearing hijab as an indication of radicalization, is basically being a visible Muslim in the public sphere is a problem. And so my sense is that what we're really dealing with here is a deep-rooted concern by the historic dominant community in the, in the state, whether it's Canadian or American, of being quite worried about losing position as the predominant ethno-racial and religious community, and also losing its dominant position in power and political terms in the state. And so this is what it seems like Bill 21 is just a more obvious, because you have an embattled Francophone settler community that is concerned about guaranteeing and protecting its distinctive position in the larger Canadian, society, to be able to preserve their own ethno-national and linguistic identity, is that it just raises the stakes so that it becomes more visible how much they have at stake in trying to marginalize and isolate other groups who can never, actually really assimilate, into what it is to be a Francophone Quebecer, right? I mean, you can speak French, but that's not going to be good enough, So I think that's a larger analysis that we have to understand. And that's why I said from the very outset is that recognizing that should reorient our politics towards coalition and solidarity with other groups, so that it's not a question of who can position themselves most advantageously vis-a-vis this hegemonic norm, but rather how can we create space for everyone to be who they are? That's the ideal, supposedly, of Canadian multiculturalism, but it's obviously that's not actually how it's working. And there clearly is a politics of fear by a certain community that they're losing their dominant position and their predominance demographically.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think, the idea of Canadian multiculturalism was always seen as this idea of a cultural mosaic. At least that's how it was presented, that you come here and you become part of, you can retain your culture and your way of life and become part of this tapestry that we have in Canada. But of course, that became quickly unmasked and realized as a kind of vertical mosaic, as a Canadian sociologist, John Porter, talked about, where it really just masked the kind of structural, systems of power that allocate people within these kinds of hierarchies. And then when you come to, the question of Quebec, you also had these reasonable accommodation debates in terms of, how do we, where Muslims were really placed as these minorities that were, unassimilable, who were, wanting society to change, who weren't willing to change their ways, but wanted society to change to accommodate them. And so how far do we have to extend that accommodation to, to basically kowtow to these, illiberal, anti-democratic, anti-woman communities, right? And so, then Quebec came up with not multiculturalism, but this idea of interculturalism, which was a little bit more about, when in Rome, we'll meet you, but you really need to become more like us, and then we can be accepting. And so, and I think what it has created within the Muslim, sort of psyche is, again, this good Muslim, bad Muslim divide, and how expressions of Muslimness, are performed in order to become the good Muslim or the bad Muslim, or the good immigrant versus bad immigrant. And so we see that in terms of, even a kind of what I call the panopticon of self-surveillance that, Muslims put themselves under, in terms of how am I, presenting myself in the public? Am I representing myself and my entire community, by the way? Because this is that burden of representation that Muslims carry. We do not have the luxury to be seen as individuals, right? Racialized communities do not have that luxury because whatever we do impacts our wider community, right? And so bearing that burden of responsibility and that burden of representation, it was something I found in my research on the 9/11 generation, where they really felt that they had to present themselves in the world, as good Muslims. So because of all the negativity in the post 9/11 context about Muslims and the negative discourses that, if they're on a bus, they want to give their seat to an elderly person or to a pregnant woman so that people can see, they are, not that that's not part of how they, see their faith and their relationship to others, but that they understood it to be also something that would represent Muslims in a different way. So they feel this profound responsibility to bear that collective representation, right? And that's a great burden, to carry, that you represent 1.5 billion people in the world, because your actions will not only reflect on you, but will reflect on that larger community. And so, young Muslims who are socialized into that reality, kind of grapple with that self-surveillance, like, what am I taking, onto the airplane? Like, I remember one of the participants in my study was just like horrified because they brought a children's book about airplanes. And they're like, why did we bring this on the airplane? Like, we may end up being deplaned. We may get questioned at customs. So there's that panopticon of self-surveillance, that I see all the time, with youth. And you will ask them, or I ask them, how has Islamophobia impacted you? And, they will often say, well, no, or I will ask how 9/11 impacted them. And they will say, yeah, no, it really didn't have a difference, But then when you press and you ask them, okay, well, what is your Muslim Student Association doing? And they'll say, well, we were going to play paintball up north, but we decided not to do that because we don't want to be seen as a terrorist cell, Oh, but 9/11 didn't affect them, right? Or, we don't play violent video games in public because we don't want people to think we're plotting something. Okay, but then, but 9/11 didn't affect us, right? So it's become so normalized as part of how they've been socialized into this world. They didn't know a world before, that these kinds of sensibilities that they've taken on board are a product of this 9/11 generation, right? So part of that includes, playing with the good Muslim trope and making sure that, you are, your expressions of Muslimness are not casting you as a subject of suspicion and scrutiny, because, as we know, Muslim youth have been heavily surveilled in this country through the security communities. Muslim student associations have been subject to visits by CSIS and the RCMP, not just on campus, but in their own homes. I know when my son was elected as the president of the Muslim Student Association at his university, the ballots were counted at night. The next morning, he had a call on his cell phone, which wasn't public, from CSIS, which is Canada's Security and Intelligence Service, wanting to talk to him, as the new president of the MSA, and can we talk about, terrorism? I've sat in on meetings with MSA and, counterterrorism units that want to talk to them about, we just want you to know terrorism is bad. And, as if they need to be schooled in understanding good from bad, right? And so, and then the ideas of, and I would question them, well, what do you mean by radicalization? Does that mean if Salman here grows a beard, or if Fatima starts wearing a niqab, what is your definition? And there never was a clear definition, right? But still, these youth have had to deal with that lack of specificity, the way that it's always referenced. The idea of terrorism has become synonymous with the Muslim subject, which is why it becomes harder to attach that label to white nationalists. And white nationalist terrorism in this country, because that is not where security communities have been focused their attention. It has always been on the Muslim, terror subject. And so as a result, this is, Muslims have taken on board different strategies in which they have to navigate this very fraught, securitized terrain, and try to prove that they are citizenship worthy, right, through these actions.
I've been increasingly saying that Muslims are citizens on probation, that your citizenship is not as expressed or has the same type of meaning that is vested in citizenship. So you always have to prove a series of elements and things that you have to remove from your citizenship. So you're suspect, and you have to go to your probational officer, which is the civil society, and to prove that you basically maybe 7 generations removed, no one from your family, going all the way back maybe to Genghis Khan, that you have no engagement whatsoever with anything remotely relative to violence, while next door neighbor is actually having stocking of weapons of mass destruction because he's going hunting. All right. So this is again a question in relations to how the Muslims are seen and treated. And maybe we could have a few more minutes for us to think about the whole concept of terrorism. And because it's part of the debate, should we use the term terrorist for these events? Who is to be labeled as such? And does it serve because it reinforces the paradigm of the war on terrorism? It's a very tough terrain to navigate. And it's a question that has arisen in many different forms in relations to this. And while maybe somebody could jump in, I want to share with people the Islamophobia reporting app. We need to report because many of these incidents are not reported. If you don't report, it didn't happen. So we want you to download the Report Islamophobia app for us to get the data, because often we go to settings and meetings and we don't have the data. And many of us who teach in the classroom, we ask our students, how many of you experience X, Y, and Z? And literally half of the class would raise their hands. But then we get the official data that is released. It's very minute, very limited. And therefore, if a tree falls in the desert or in the forest, and it's not on Twitter or Instagram, did it really fall? So in a sense, we need to think about reporting and making sure that these incidents are there. So if you are able to share the app and get the data in order for us to really get a clearer picture of what is taking place. So back to the question on terrorism and to use it, not to use it, what are the difficulties in navigating that terrain? Anyone could jump in.
Well, I mean, I would just say that I'm not too eager to make explicit demands to charge people under the terrorism laws, because, as you were alluding to, Hatem, it really does reinforce the logic of the state's way of defining terrorism. And just to go back to that issue of Muslims having a very contingent citizenship, I mean, I recently sat on a dissertation defense just actually last week about comparing Canada and France about unbelonging and the way in which Muslims have been made sort of citizen others through a whole variety of mechanisms, and the logics and presumptions behind that. You know, many of the things that Jasmin was talking about, and that research is going to be so important and fascinating. I mean, I just had today a meeting with Muslim students who, are obviously reeling from the events, the fear that has been created, and are seeking some kind of comfort and solidarity and support. And, what we realize is that they have undergone a very different formation than those of our age and generation have, having grown up, post 9/11. So that 9/11 generation idea is going to be so important to bring some documentation and insight about those consequences and effects, because their needs are really different. My initial thought entirely was, well, let's get together and make demands, and let's organize, and let's do educational activities. And they have grown up in an era where that seems very dangerous. Their first sense is that they have suffered so much psychological pressure that a big event like this just absolutely triggers all kinds of vulnerabilities and fear. And it's a very different prospect. And so there's a lot of healing and support that's going to be needed for people to really come to being able to defend and fight for citizenship and rights, because they've been really kind of in some ways brutalized by the atmosphere of the global war on terrorism and its consequences on our culture and society. So that was some element that I just wanted to reinforce. But just on the terrorism, 98% of the people who've been charged under these terrorism laws are Muslims in Canada. Only
Same as in France and the UK.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah. But only in 2 cases were they actually for acts that were committed. They're always preemptive. It's part of, using the terrorism laws, to surveil, to harass, to monitor, the examples Jasmin already gave, and also to charge them under it. It's sort of the pre-crime kind of situation. And of course, there's no equivalence that is going to happen when you're talking about white supremacist attacks on Muslims. These people have not been monitored. They've not been surveilled. They've not been harassed. ISIS has not been talking to them to say, hey, you shouldn't be doing these things. So the whole architecture of the state and its approach to terrorism is racialized, and it has marked out Muslims in particular. And so it's a very dangerous game, it seems to me, to play, when I would much rather us fight together with all kinds of persecuted and communities that are suffering the way in which the RCMP and arms of state law enforcement, like indigenous people, so we have also the same situation where, RCMP is supposedly going to help conduct these investigations, of, killings of indigenous children and their mass, burial and so on. How could they be trusted to do this in a serious and honest way when they were the ones who removed these children? So this is the kind of logic that Muslims who now want to get politically active, engaged, need to pay attention to, so that we don't fall into the trap of reproducing these oppressive state structures, but actually try and dismantle them on all of our behalves. And I guess my final point about that is that one reason why Islamophobia is not going to disappear if Muslims just assimilate it is because it's too useful. It's too useful to the state for a whole variety of mechanisms. And so it's really more about changing those structures if we really want to eliminate Islamophobia. That's all I would say on that.
Anyone else on the subject of use of the term terrorism and the pitfalls?
I think, just in response to what Adnan was saying, because on the one hand, I can see the logic and I can see why one wouldn't want to use that. On the other hand, in a case like this with the London murders, if you don't use the term terrorism to describe that terrifying act, or Alexander Bissonnette, that terrifying act, then basically it's only the Muslims that are the terrorists. So I think labels have a weight, and we need to be really careful about whenever we're going to use a label of what kind of sort of political valence it's going to have, but also how it can turn the whole thing around. Like, this label, ideologically motivated violent extremism. Wow, I don't even know who came up with that, but IMVE for short. I mean, seriously, how much does it cover up? A lot. And in that process, what kind of ideological work is it doing to cover that up? So there's a silencing of Islamophobia. There is a silencing and a kind of sort of dismissal or diminishing of the hurt and the pain and the violence of it, which is why I think it makes it sort of imperative to call this act a terrifying act and an act of terror, and to be able to charge that, because that didn't happen with Alexander Bissonnette. It didn't happen with the guy who did the mosque shooting. So, and he got away. And so basically, because there is a whole, aside from the fact that that it's Muslims that have been charged with this in a preemptive way, there is all kinds of baggage that goes with that term as well, which carries over way after. And it's not going to affect these guys once they get out, especially if they're going to use, defenses that say that they're mentally incapacitated at the time. And one has to wonder, like, why, when you're mentally incapacitated, would you think that people who are different are a threat? What was in your mind before to actually conjure that up? Why not look at an insect instead?
We have 3 more minutes left, so maybe we could get the last word. What gives you hope in terms of the work that you're doing in relation to Islamophobia, and what possibly help things that we could do collectively to confront this? I know this is just an hour and a half. We have much, much more to do. So just 1 minute just to take us on maybe a note of what's next, and then we could conclude this conversation. But let's begin with Adnan.
Well, I mean, that's a very big question, and I think my colleagues are actually more practically engaged with some of these. I mean, I know there has been a call to have a national summit of sorts on the problem of Islamophobia, which would be a useful first step, at least to acknowledge, because I think that's a big part of this, is that it may seem obvious to us that it's Islamophobia and what Islamophobia is, means, and does. But unfortunately, that's still a very contested category, which is why it took 4 years to finally have a National Day of Remembrance and Action, on Islamophobia after the 2017 massacre. So I think that could be useful, at least in bringing attention to recognize that this is real and needs to be confronted. That's a good first step. But I think part of the problem is even our allies in the equity, diversity, inclusion world, in institutions, whether it's corporate ones or in universities where I'm, and we're familiar with, is they don't seem to take Islamophobia seriously in the same way that they do anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. They don't see it as systemic and as endemic. So if there's an explicit case of something, they may be able to deal with it. And these are our best allies, okay? People who are professionally engaged in it. So I think some work needs to be done, in directing these sorts of groups to really understand, so that in their policies and practices within these institutions, they're actually considering and understanding Islamophobia. That might be also a good institutional thing, to work in each of our institutions, to have a seminar and have a workshop to say, you may not understand exactly how Islamophobia works. So we need to educate you on that.
And Yasmin?
Yeah, I agree totally with that. And I think, the point about how, in fact, Islamophobia is kind of absented out of discussions around racism is itself really dangerous. I thought, just watching the whole sort of COVID-19 landscape play out, the mediascape particularly, it was very interesting to see how indigeneity was on one side, anti-Black racism on the other side, and then this whole silent middle. So you had this book-ended structure with nobody talking about the middle until the anti-Asian racism sort of was brought forward. And Islamophobia is never there. So, and yet it is persistent all the time. So it doesn't just come up with any kind of incident, it's ongoing. And this is the issue, is how come? And I think, having things like IMVE tells you why.
Jasmin?
I think, and I echo what Yasmin and Adnan have also raised, the kind of, visibility of Islamophobia, but then its absence, in terms of the kinds of policies and strategies that need to be attention focused on it. So that is something, and its absence from a lot of the solidarity movements that are talking about decolonization, that are talking about racism, but never include Islamophobia within that. That is something I've noticed for a very long time in Canada. But I also want us to be attentive to understanding Islamophobia as a unique form of oppression because of the fact that there are actually industries behind its promotion. and that does make it a very unique system. And so I think it's important to really begin to shed light on the various dimensions of Islamophobia so that we can talk about, you know, the different ways in which there needs to be action to address it, right? There's the individual, there's ideological, there's systemic, there's all sorts of dimensions through which we need to attend to it. Because if we only look at one, we are not going to be addressing those others. And then we need to look at the interconnection with other struggles and bring those together in alliance and solidarity so that we don't have what, you know, Adnan was mentioning with the Quebec mosque attack, 4 years of national amnesia before finally there was a day of remembrance. And so, you know, the ingredients that I talked about that came together for this tragedy to occur, you know, in London, Ontario are still there. And so we have no assurance that those factors are going to be dealt with. And the community needs that assurance of safety and the assurance that others are going to support us and that we are going to have the resources that we need, whether it's for us in academia to be educating about this, to be talking about Islamophobia in Canada and globally, and being able to do that through, you know, research chairs, through centers, through, you know, hiring. You know, there's very few of us who actually teach Islamophobia studies here. So we need that resource to be able to continue this work before there's another tragedy.
Thank you, Jasmin, for this last piece of on the conclusion, because often the university will try to bring a public relations person to try to teach about Islamophobia. And their only knowledge about Islam is that they landed next to an airport and there was a mosque about a mile away from the hotel. So I'm hoping that as we get more into this really serious work on Islamophobia, as well as thinking of the various challenges, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the indigenous community, anti-Asian racism, and the whole distraction that is there. Hopefully that our collective work, and I always try to find ways for us to really look at the different contexts of Islamophobia, whether it's Canada, US, Europe, New Zealand, India, and other places. So this conversation was an enriching one. I do pray and hope for the well-being of everyone in Canada. In the announcement, we said it's targeting the Pakistani Muslim community, but it's all the Muslims in Canada have been affected, as well as our allies. This is a labor of love to try to really undo the ravages of discrimination, of racism, of Islamophobia. So I wish you and all your families the best. May your days constantly be one that is filled with peace, tranquility, and may our struggle for justice be actualized and realized. I do believe that the future horizon is one of positiveness, and it is that which we are trying to form. So thank you and wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum.